Hi, everyone. Welcome to the And God Said podcast. I'm Reverend Kimberly Constant, and this podcast is in conjunction with my Bible study, Cover to Cover, in which we read through the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation in about a 9-month time frame. So we have been rocking and rolling our way through the book of Exodus, and today we are going to talk about what happens after the people emerge from the Red Sea. So when we last left the Israelites in the story, they have just emerged from this miraculous parting of water. They were singing and dancing, led by Moses' sister Miriam and some of the women. And they have this beautiful song about just the miraculous, amazing events and God's deliverance of them. You can imagine that this is a high for them. What a moment. What a moment. But they don't get too long to celebrate because they are immediately plunged into a time of difficulty. So that is where we're going to start today, into the desert. So the journey to Sinai, like I said, occurs after the Hebrews are delivered from Egypt. And certainly that deliverance is one of the most significant events in Exodus and in the entirety of the Old Testament. You will see much reference as we continue to read through the Bible to the events that happened there and to God's deliverance of the people. This is for the Israelites of the Old Testament as important as the events of the cross and Jesus' resurrection are for believers, Christian believers, and people in the New Testament. But the meaning of it at this point, having just emerged from the Red Sea, is somewhat of a mystery. I mean, now the question becomes, okay, what now? What are you going to do with us, God? What does this mean for us as your people? Where do we go from here? We have to remember here that God's deliverance is not just for the sake of deliverance. Yes, God wants that for human beings. He loves us. He is for us. He is with us always, and He wants to alleviate injustice. But we have to remember this creation that God created is an open one. There's some freedom within limitations and boundaries, yes, but people get to make choices for good or bad, and often bad things do happen. And so God isn't always delivering us from those things. And so we have to start to understand, what does deliverance mean? Sometimes God walks with us through difficulties, sometimes He delivers us from them. Deliverance is always in order to restore and to move people forward in their faith journey. God wants to form this group of people into a nation to become a vehicle of His grace. So it's not just for their sake, although yes, that's important. They cried out to Him, God heard them. He wanted to rescue them from the wicked Pharaoh and the injustice happening there. But now it's going to be for a purpose. I'm going to use you to reach the rest of the world. But first, before we get to that, they have to journey through this vast desert wilderness. And the route from Egypt to Mount Sinai is harsh. It is desert, mountainous desert, like nothing pretty, no trees for shade. If there were, they were typically shorter shrubs. This was unforgiving terrain. And remember, this is a large group of people. This is real life. People are having children on the way. People are dying. People are getting sick. There's women with young children to tend to as they march through this wilderness. They have to figure out where and how they're going to eat, how they're going to drink. It was difficult, more than maybe we can imagine. And it is enough to make them start to doubt everything. We also have to remember who these people are. The large majority of them, the Hebrews, are former slaves. Many of them have also come from other ancient Near Eastern groups, people that saw the events of the plagues and thought, I'm going to go with those people because I believe that their God is efficacious and really is the one true God. And so they're a ragtag bunch. They don't share the same language, customs, culture. Most of them have been slaves. They're kind of the marginalized people of that time. and they're dealing with the reality of life on the road. As slaves, they didn't have education. They had been provided for, yes, poorly. Pharaoh was a terrible slave master. Not that any of them are ever good, but he's trying to kill their children as well. But he did provide them food and cared for them so that they could then work for him. Cared for him, in quotation marks. It's not like he was caring for them, but he did provide some sort of food, a roof over their heads. And they're going to kind of start to look back at that and be like, well, at least we ate when we were with Pharaoh. What are we going to do now, Moses? There's no food to be seen, that kind of thing. So, as frustrating as it can be to read this story, because you think God just parted the waters of a giant body of water and let you walk through it. God delivered you from Pharaoh. You were spared from the worst effects of the plagues. How could you not trust God? At the same time, remember who they are and remember the difficulty of the journey and the very humanness of this experience. And just, it's very relatable. It is to me anyway, in my own faith journey of the times when I'm like, okay, God, but where's the food? Where's the water? Where's the sustenance to get through this day? And it can be hard to remember even something as spectacular as the parting of the Red Sea. So difficulties and testing on the way to Sinai. We see a pattern emerge as these people make their way to the mountain. The first complaint comes because they reach Mara and the water is bitter and they're thirsty. They're in the desert. It's hot. It's dusty. It's dry. It makes sense that they're thirsty and they complain. Perhaps, a little too crudely, but we understand how frustrating, again, it would be and how scared they were. And so they cry out, what are we supposed to drink? And Moses cries out and God provides a solution. Then we see the same thing happen in the desert of Sin, this time with food. They're hungry and the people complain. And here's where we start to see language, well, gosh, maybe we should just go back to Egypt because at least we had food. And so 2 times God provides food for them. First manna, but then remember, they're like, oh, this is great, but are we never going to get meat too? We need our protein. And so then he provides them with quail. This account, the account in the desert of Sin with the manna and the quail, is also important in that God is able to reinforce the importance and necessity of Sabbath. We can imagine that living in slavery under Pharaoh, perhaps Sabbath wasn't something that they were able to practice very easily. Also, remember they have some other ancient Near Eastern peoples joining them, and so God's kind of reinstilling that as fundamental to the way that God made us. This is the pattern that we are to follow, and we are to rest, even in the desert, even in the harshness, even when there's no food or water to be seen. We are to rest and trust that God will provide. And so they learn that when they gather too much manna and it goes moldy, etc. And then the third incident happens at Rephidim. There's no water again. The people complain, and once again, God provides a solution. So you can see that even though the people are getting worse and worse in their complaints and not really showing a lot of trust here or faith in God, God continues to provide for them. It's not like he goes, oh, I'm done. You're complaining way too much. You're on your own. Like I'm washing my hands of you. No, God continues to provide a solution for them. Remember, God meets us where we are. God walks with us. He's going to push us. He's going to push the Israelites to move forward, to become who he wants them to be, who he knows they can be. But he's also going to be patient and gentle, especially in the beginning as they're finding their way. So God responds to all the complaints with miracle after miracle, right? The water where there's wood thrown in and the water is no longer bitter, the manna and quail, the water at Rephidim. He is definitively showing the people, you can trust me. It may look like there is no solution to your practical physical problem, but I am the God who provides. So this becomes a way for God to really showcase, you can trust me. I am for you. I am not going to let you starve in the desert. So there's also a lot of language of testing in this section, that God is using this to test the people. Will the people learn to live by faith? And one scholar wrote something that I thought was so beautiful. So I just put the quote here on my PowerPoint and I'm going to read it to you. And I'm sorry, I don't know the scholar's name. I found it in an old book and I probably could have looked it up, but didn't have the time to. So I just am quoting an unknown scholar. He wrote, "We demand a proof of God in an incident, in an instant. But one cannot prove God. One can only know him. And that only gradually in a lifelong friendship. The perpetual happy surprises of the years, ever adding new wonder to our knowledge of the ways of him we love." So I think this is such an important point to make. We want proof of God. I want to know, God, that you really exist. Are you real? Are you out there? Do you hear me? Do you see me? These are common, good questions to ask, things that start us on the journey of faith. But how can you really prove God? There's whole books and people way smarter than me that have written on this topic and debate it, and believers and unbelievers alike. And it comes down to relationship. And how do you ever prove relationship? I use the example of my love for my children. I have 4 children. How can I prove to you, if you are someone who doesn't know me, that I love my children? I can't offer you any kind of tangible proof. You have to get to know me as a person. You have to watch the way that I relate to my children, the things that I do for them, the things that I say about them, when I stand by them through thick and thin, when I love them through the difficult years and the good years, the same. That's how you come to know, okay, you know what? Over time, she's proving out that she really does love them. The same thing with a spouse or with any relationship we have. How can you prove that someone is really your friend? Relationships are not made of things that we can touch and taste and see and prove with. It's made of a lifetime, a long time, years and years of evidence of support and care and journeying and concern and lifting one each other up and holding one another accountable, all of these things. The same is true for our relationship with God. It is proved out over time. Luckily, in our day and time, we have the Bible. This is why this Bible study, I believe, is so important. This is the story of God providing for people, proving out himself over time. The Israelites are the vehicle that allows God to teach all of us who he is and that he does provide and that the desert is no match for him. Satan is no match. He's not even competition at all. God will provide. God is with us. God never leaves us. God will not forsake you. God is for you and God loves you. That is proved out through the pages of the Bible, and then it bleeds into your own life as you begin your journey of faith with God. So we are so blessed in our day and time to have this, to have the Word of God. Remember, these people don't, and they're the first. They're the pioneers of our faith, and they're given much deference, and they should be, because in this difficult time when everything was so foreign to what God is trying to do, they are, the first to walk with God, and they teach us so much. So lessons in leadership for Moses. As God's preparing and providing for the people for their physical needs, he's also helping Moses along in his leadership development. So we see a few things happen with Moses that show God providing for him. The first is one of my favorite stories. It's in Exodus 17, and it's the defeat of the Amalekites. So Moses says to the people, the Amalekites come and they attack the Israelites, and he says, all right, we're going to fight these people. Go, Joshua, take our people into battle, and I'll stand on top of the hill with God's staff in my hands, kind of, presiding over everything. But it's exhausting. It lasts all day, and his arms get tired. I can't even imagine. I bet that staff was really heavy. And so Aaron and Hur help him. They hold up his arms because they notice that when his arms start to fall, the Israelites start to lose. So they hold up his arms, and then Joshua finds success on the battlefield. Just such a beautiful story of why we need each other and how we can be there for one another in community. And then God tells Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it. So we've got lessons in leadership for Moses, but also for Joshua. Joshua is going to be really important. He is going to be the leader that follows in Moses' footsteps and the one that actually gets to take the people into the promised land. So all along, Joshua is getting prepared as well. The next thing that happens is the advice from Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. And this is a great story too. So we have to pay attention, first of all, to Jethro's acknowledgement of the Lord. So in Exodus 18:11, he says to Moses, Moses is telling him the stories of everything that happened and how they got away from Pharaoh and all the ways God has provided for them. And Jethro goes, now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods. Now, scholars argue about this, about whether he's actually saying he believes in God for himself, or he's just kind of acknowledging, oh, your God is an awesome God. Because remember, in the ancient Near East, they worshipped all sorts of gods and goddesses. They didn't think it was strange that other people would worship a different God. And so perhaps Jethro was just like, that's great, Moses. Your God is awesome. But I think it's a statement of faith. And we're going to see a similar statement made by Rahab in the book of Joshua. I think Jethro's like, yep, this is the one true God. It's the same as the people that joined in the Exodus, that the people that left Egypt weren't all Hebrews. There were Egyptians. There were people from other ancient Near Eastern groups. People that saw what happened and said, yep, that's my God. I'm going to worship that God. And I think Jethro's saying the same thing here. And then Jethro gives Moses really good advice. What you are doing is not good. Moses was doing all of the work himself. He says the work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. In other words, delegate, Moses. And this is important. We went from Moses kind of very hesitantly accepting the mantle of leadership back at the burning bush. Like, are you sure, God? I'm not good at speaking. I don't know if I can do this. Pick someone else. To now, like, the opposite end of the pendulum. I need to do it all myself. It's all on my shoulders. I have to bear the responsibility and the weight of the work for all the people. And Jethro's like, there's a middle ground here. Sometimes it is good to delegate. It is helpful. We know this to be true. It's not only good for the leader, it's good for the people. You've got to develop other leadership underneath you. Just one leader all on their own is not going to be as effective as if they have people bought into their leadership. So the lesson Moses learns, don't go it alone. This is a lesson for all of us. God likes to use other humans to help. We've seen this already. We're going to see it again through the entirety of the Bible. God works through people. Sometimes he will work a miracle, absolutely. Sometimes he just speaks through the words of a loving father-in-law. And in a way, isn't that just as miraculous? Because this was a father-in-law that didn't even worship God to begin with. So it's another beautiful story, maybe a little less flashy than the parting of the Red Sea, but personally, I like it even more. All right, they finally get to Mount Sinai. What is Mount Sinai and where is it? Well, this is going to be not satisfactory to you because most scholars and archaeologists say they just aren't sure. No one knows the exact location of what in the Old Testament they're calling Mount Sinai. Now, certainly there's mountains in the Sinai desert. It's just the question of which one is Mount Sinai, because none of them now have that specific name. I think the majority of scholars would say it's in the southern portion of Sinai, either Jebel Musa or Jebel Serbal. I've highlighted Jebel Musa because that's where the monastery of St. Catherine is. And the picture I used on the opening slide of the PowerPoint, or if you click on the YouTube video, that picture that's there, that's the monastery of St. Catherine. And so it's at the bottom of Jebel Musa, which many people believe to be Mount Sinai. But there are scholars who argue no, it was in the north or more in the middle of the desert. Some associate it with Mount Horeb, which is where Moses was at sort of the foot of that mountain when God sent the burning bush. But there's really nothing definitive. Nonetheless, its theological significance is very clear. It is at Mount Sinai that God formed this ragtag group of people into a nation with a missional purpose to make God known. And he does this with very practical ways that would have been familiar to them. With law and covenant, he creates structure and definition. With the calendar, he organizes their time according to seasons and festivals and things that they need to do. And then via the tabernacle, which will allow God to be enthroned in their midst. So we will talk through all of those aspects as we move forward through Exodus. First, let's talk about covenant. Here's covenant again. So remember, we've seen the kind of implied covenant with God and Adam and Eve, the Noah covenant. We've talked about the Abrahamic covenant, and now we turn to the Mosaic covenant. And here, God cements the relationship between himself and the nation of Israel. So let's look at, if you have your Bibles, open it up to Exodus 19, and I'm going to read from verses 3 through 6. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So in this declaration, God is saying that all of Israel is now going to be the suzerain. Remember the covenant contract where there was the suzerain who pledges unfailing loyalty to the vassal. So Israel as a whole becomes that party, and they must remain unfailingly loyal to God, fighting his battles, obeying his commands, and loving him and him alone. And notice it's God that instigated this relationship. God drew these people out of Egypt. He brings them to himself at Mount Sinai, and it is for the purpose of making himself known. So a word here about the language of treasured possession and this kind of favoritism God seems to be bestowing on Israel. It's not because Israel earned it. They weren't even a nation. They're just a random group of people. It's because God chose the least, the last, the lost, the people who had no agency, who were, most of them, enslaved by a wicked Pharaoh, who could do nothing for themselves. God chose that group to be his hands and feet. That's the kind of God we serve. He could have picked Egypt. That would have made more sense. That's what a human might have done. I'm going to pick the biggest and the best and the strongest to be my people group. Everyone will pay attention. If I pick Egypt, everyone's going to listen because everyone's already afraid of Egypt to begin with. No, God chooses Egypt's slaves. That says so much about God right there. Now, this covenant differs greatly from the Abrahamic covenant. In that covenant, remember, God took the oath. He kind of took on both aspects of the covenantal relationship. And in a sense, to Abraham, he said, if you and your people break this covenant, if you're not loyal to me, then may I be torn into two. That's not the case here with the Mosaic covenant. Here, the people take the oath. They become bound by stipulations. So there will be consequences when they fail to uphold this covenant. And of course, the big piece of this covenant that we all know, probably even if you're not a believer, if you've never studied the Bible, you've heard of the Ten Commandments. That's a big piece. And then we also have what's called Mosaic law. The Ten Commandments are part of that, but there's actually way more laws than just those 10. Yes, these are rules, but we're also going to discover they're anchored very much in God's grace. And another thing to note, not just for this portion of Exodus, but for the rest of it, it gets confusing. There's repetitive, multiple accounts. Things aren't necessarily in order. They have multiple versions of a story, and so they don't quite know. Instead of just picking one or over the other or meshing them together, they just kind of put both things in. So as we work through it, just know that there's going to be times where you're like, why are they saying this again? They already said it. That is evidence of this editorial process, which they weren't really editorial, were they? Because they just kind of threw it all in there together. So the Ten Commandments, this is in Exodus 20. The original form, the primitive ancient Hebrew, probably just had about 2 words for each commandment. Over time, it got expanded a little bit, explained, and so the form we have reflects these editorial contributions. So lots of opportunities here in Exodus to note where editors have added to the material. Even Moses himself might have been like, okay, God gave me these 2 words, but I need to explain better so that people in the future who are only referencing this document or this handed down oral tradition, they need to understand what I'm talking about. So scholars say that these 10 commandments get set apart from the rest of the law because, if you notice, God utters them directly to the people. And that's going to freak the people out. They're going to get scared and terrified of this appearance of the voice. There's lightning and thunder. Like whenever God shows up, it is an awesome event. We would be falling on our faces if God were to come into our midst. And so that's what happens here. And after the 10 Commandments, the people are like, oh, Moses, would you please just go get the rest of the law and let us know later because we cannot, we're terrified by what's happening. So God utters the 10 Commandments to the people, and the rest he just tells Moses, and Moses relays to the people. Of course, the basis of all of these commandments is God himself. He identifies himself as Adonai Elohim. So this is verse 2. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That's God's self-identification, the foundation he sets before he proclaims these commandments. So Adonai Elohim also includes a plural second pronoun. I put y'all. If you're from the South, you know what y'all means. Y'all means you, plural. And it's really quite intelligent of Southerners to have created this because it makes it a lot easier to explain a plural you. So he's saying, y'all, all of Israel, I am your God, your personal God. He is not just Adonai Elohim, but all y'all's Adonai Elohim. He is also deliverer. He is the God that brought them out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. Notice what's important here. This is the definition God chooses for himself over all other possible options. He could have called himself creator of the universe. That's sort of the theme in Genesis, right? God is creator, and here's his creation, and here's why. But no, here we're learning about him as deliverer. And note also that God is not asking people to obey the law in order to earn grace. He's asking them to obey the law because they already did earn his grace. They've been rescued. They've been set free. And now the response is to enter into this relationship defined by covenant, because that's how they understood relationships in their time, and to obey God in response to the salvation. This is the opposite of what a normal vassal suzerain contract would have been. A typical covenant would have been, okay, we're this small fledgling nation. We need help. We need protection. We need resources. And the vassal would say, okay, I will give you all those things, and in return, you have to pledge me loyalty. But God gave them all those things before they ever pledged loyalty, because that is who God is. And that is going to have lots of implications for even the New Testament when we get there. So the commandments themselves, often they're categorized into different sections. So the first 4 could be thought of as religious duties, and then the last 6 are moral duties. Some people put the 5th commandment, which is to honor your parents, with religious duties because in the ancient Near East, this was a matter of religion. Honoring your parents was very important. In some cultures in our modern world, that remains true. And in even some other religions, we see ancestors play a prominent role. So it could be considered a religious duty too. Then commandments 6 through 8 are directed against mean deeds, things that you can do that are mean. Commandment 9 directed against mean words, and commandment 10 directed against mean thoughts. This code, this 10 commandment portion contains the essence of the life of God's nation, Israel. God's going to add additional laws, some very specific things, but these have this universal appeal, a universal application. These are things that make sense. And so we still try to obey these even in New Testament times, even though Jesus says, I've come and I fulfilled the law, and now we're going after the meaning behind the law, which is to love your neighbor, to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. But these still hold true. These are ways in which we can love God and we can love our neighbor as ourselves. So these kind of help us define what exactly that means. The rest of the law is what we call the Mosaic law. Now, they wouldn't have seen separation. It would have just all been law to them, all covenantal terms. This is just for our benefit as we're trying to distinguish between maybe laws that we still follow, 10 commandments, they make sense, they're good, they're universal, versus specific things like you can't wear more than 2 threads in your piece of clothing. That's specific, that's done, we don't have to worry about that one anymore. So for these laws, Moses becomes the mediator because, as I said, the people are afraid. We can't handle this. Moses, you just go find out the rest of the laws for us and let us know. This is an important thing to note in the Old Testament, something that gets a little lost, I think, in modern times. There's a healthy appreciation of God's otherness and holiness. In some ways, it's a good thing that in the New Testament, Jesus brings this expanded definition and he calls God our Father and Abba, which is Daddy. And there's this sense of like intimacy and relationship with God. And we've got the song, when I get to heaven, am I going to just run into your arms? And that's wonderful. But we cannot forget God's holiness and his otherness. He is not human. We use pronouns, we use human language to describe God because it's all that we have. We can't describe God in God's own terms because it wouldn't even make sense to us. So we attribute human things to God, but God is so much more than that. And were God to be present and were he to pop up here in my closet where I'm recording this, I would be falling on my face immediately. Then I might get up and be like, can I give you a hug? But the first reaction, and what we see time and again in the Old Testament when people are confronted with God, there's a falling on the face, like, oh my goodness, I am not worthy to be in your presence. So they understand that well, and you'll see that continue to pop up in the Old Testament. This law is also known as the Covenant Code. They're civil laws that govern the community life of an agricultural society. So we've got some very specific things to that type of society. There's a lot of laws about cattle, what happens if your neighbor's cow accidentally kills your cow, things like that. So it really teaches us a lot about what kind of people we're dealing with the nation of Israel. There's ritual and moral precepts, and these come in the form of direct commands. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to not do. There's also legal decisions, and these are introduced by an if clause. If your neighbor's cow runs over your child, then they have to do, etc., etc. So things to guide making judicial decisions. Embodied in these laws, note that there is a great deal of sympathy and empathy for weak and defenseless people. for widows and orphans, for poor people, for strangers. We talked last week in our discussion group about Genesis and kind of the bad things that were happening. The patriarchs were married to multiple people. They kind of gave their wives around freely if it suited their purpose. They had slaves. There's things going on that we know in our time is not acceptable. And we don't really see God step in very much and say, like, hey, you should probably just have one wife. He kind of lets things play out there. He's moving the people to a greater understanding, to a place of holiness, but it's a slow journey. And so we see in the law a lot of talk of provision for the people on the outside, because the more they can embody the Spirit, the more close they get to God, the better of a relationship they have with the Lord. Some of this will be a moot point because they will be living holy, pure, good lives. You won't need to have to be married to multiple women because you'll just provide for widows and orphans and poor people, regardless of if they're your wife or not. We talked about that polygamy in the ancient Near East was almost a necessity. There were more women than men because men were fighting battles and hunting and getting into accidents. I'm sure women too were having issues in childbirth, and there was disease. And anyway, it was an awful, hard life to live. And in order to provide for women, they would often marry more than one. Because if you didn't have a husband, if you didn't have a son, and you didn't have a father, you had no way to provide for yourself except for prostitution. There were no jobs that a woman could go do to provide for herself. So sometimes it's said that polygamy was a way to do that. You can marry more than one woman and then provide for her. Of course, there's benefits clearly for the man in that situation too, and it's not something that God's ever going to condone outright. And we're going to see it kind of dissipate and not be a practice anymore as a people, they grow closer to God. But just note that God doesn't immediately say you can't do this, because God's got to provide a framework to provide for people, maybe without using polygamy as an option, for instance. So these laws improve upon existing conditions. They advance the concepts of justice and morality, but they don't necessarily fully eradicate bad practices or things that we now know are not in line with God's will for us. I can just not say this enough. God meets us where we are and then gently moves us forward. Many of these laws no longer apply to us, thank goodness. They are useful for understanding God, and like I said, so useful for understanding what these people are up against, what life was like in the ancient Near East, kind of what their concerns are. And we'll talk more about this later. But a lot of them, we can wear more than one type of cloth. We know from the New Testament, there's not things that are unclean for us to eat any longer. So a lot of this is going to change for us. So radical law. The Mosaic Covenant is allowing God to define good and bad. In an ancient Near Eastern world where a lot of things that we know are bad were considered good. It is a wild, wild west world. People are sacrificing their children. They are engaging in temple prostitution. They are clothing inanimate objects and leaving food for their gods and goddesses because they think that they have to do this. It's totally different from what God wants. And so this law allows God to delineate boundaries, to show the difference between himself and these false little g gods and goddesses of the rest of the world, and to show that this is the way we're going to live, differently from the way that the rest of the ancient Near East lives. So Adonai, he's not going to require human sacrifice. He is not going to require self-mutilation. He is not going to require temple prostitution. He also is not going to speak to the people by means of magic or divination. Divination is where they would use the organs of animals and kind of try to read them almost like tea leaves. Adonai exists independent of creation. He does not need to be fed or clothed or given fancy gifts or temples. God does not need humans to provide for God. God is going to provide for humans. And all of this, the understanding is Adonai, the one true God, is unique. And he expects his people, this nation that he is forming for himself, to reflect that uniqueness in their own way of life. They need to stand apart so that they can be noticed. They're going to stand apart. They're going to look different. The other people of the ancient Near East are going to go, who are these people and what is going on with them? I want to know more. And they're going to learn about God through the way that the Israelites are living. Christians believe that the law was a partial, time and culture bound revelation of the character of God. So, this is what I was just saying. For us, a lot of this does not apply to our here and now. We have to tread very lightly. We don't want to throw all this out and say that the Old Testament doesn't matter anymore, because that's not true either. The law is still full of good things. It teaches us what is right and wrong. Jesus is going to say, I came to fulfill it, not to cancel it, not to throw it out, not to make it obsolete, but to fulfill it. And so we need to understand what this law is so we can understand what Jesus has done for us. This law helps us to know right and wrong, helps us to see that we cannot possibly ever earn our own holiness and that we need something more. And then Jesus, when we get to him in the New Testament, is going to help us understand this. He's going to redefine some of these laws. He's going to tell us which ones are important and which ones aren't. And in some, he's even going to go further than what the law says. So we're going to learn a lot more when we get to Jesus. Some other boundaries that God sets up for the people, the calendar. So he gives really definition to their time. And I never thought about it this way before, but I think this is such a smart way to put it. I got this from Sandra Richter, of course, my favorite. So she talked about, God defines the people in terms of rules, but he also gives them boundaries for their time. We're going to look at this more in Leviticus, because Leviticus really goes through much more specifically all the different feasts and festivals and of course the sacrificial system. So more on that to come. And then we have the tabernacle, which that we're going to get to in a couple of lectures. So after he gives the terms of the covenant is ratified. So this segment of reading ends with kind of a big dinner party. They all gather together. This is chapter 24. And it's Moses, and it's like 70 of the elders of Israel, Joshua, of course, because he's always there. And it's interesting wording, and it gets confusing, like who can and cannot approach the Lord, because we see a lot like, oh, don't come near because you're going to get, burnt up if you get too close to God. No one can see God's face and live. But then these people are eating and they're seeing God. So it's like, well, I thought you said you couldn't see God's face and live. So what's happening? I think it's that they're eating and they're at a distance. So yeah, they're seeing God, but from a great distance. Maybe even a veiled version. They're not seeing the full radiance of God. We'll see that later with Moses, when Moses says, show me your glory, and God says, I can't show you the whole thing, or you'll cease to live because I'm that holy. But I can hide you behind this rock and I can let you see after I pass by. So something I think akin to that is happening here. It's true that no one can look fully into the face of God and live. Moses gets really close, though, because Moses is so holy and righteous. He can get closer to God than most people can. But even there, I don't think he's seeing, he's seeing as God said. He's hiding him in a cleft. He's protecting him from seeing the fullness of God's radiance. If any of us saw the fullness of God's radiance, we would immediately be with God in heaven, because it would be too much for us as human beings. So we do get this image of God with this like bright blue lake, like a lapis. Lapis is a gemstone, a really bright blue under his feet. We're going to see similar wording. So just note that. You're going to see it again whenever there's a description of God on his throne. It's similar language that will be used. And God beckons Moses to come closer. Like I said, Moses is the closest I think a human gets to God. Maybe Isaiah too, but Moses gets really close to him. I still don't think it's the fullness of God's presence, though. And of course, Moses brings Joshua to stand guard, because we're remembering that God is preparing Joshua as well, because God knows that Joshua will be the one to lead them into the promised land. So we read in Exodus 24:17-18, to the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. Moses entered the cloud as he went on up the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So this sets the stage for the disastrous things that are going to happen next with the golden calf. Imagine the fear. There's this consuming fire, and they see Moses' journey into it, and they have no idea for over a month what is going on. Did he just get burned up? Because God said no one could see his face and live. What is happening? And it's going to cause a lot of fear, and fear often leads to disaster. So that's up in our next lecture. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will catch you for the story of the golden calf.